Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arline Sachs, and this is Chuck Mason. And today we're going to talk about heirlooms and what you can possibly learn from an heirloom. And one of the things you had passed down was a picture.
Well, actually, it wasn't passed down.
Oh.
It was something that my mother had, but unfortunately, at the time I got started in genealogy, I was having a hard time finding out about when my great-grandmother, my mother's mother, actually died in Philadelphia, because I couldn't get access to vital records and couldn't get a death certificate, couldn't find anything else out about her. And I had talked to my mother, and my mother thought she remembered her grandmother coming to spend a month with them when she turned 12, which would have been 1940. And my mother's oldest sister said, "Oh no, she died before your mother was born in 1928. And so I didn't really have
sort of a big
anything. And I happened to go home, and I think we have a picture of Emma and the poem. I happened to go home, and my mother had, sitting on the edge of a ledge on a china cabinet, this little poem that is about Mother, and it's in a little frame. And I picked it up, that's it, and I picked it up and I flipped it over to the back, and the back of it was inscribed, "To Mother Cronmiller from daughter Emma, 1938. And I knew right away this was my grandmother's youngest sister, Emma, giving this poem to her mother, Emma, probably for Mother's Day bands. It says May 1938, but I knew that my great-grandmother was alive in 1938, so it disproved my aunt, gave some proof to what my mother said. And probably about 3 years ago, Pennsylvania started opening up more recent death records, and I found out she actually died later in 1938. So my mother was a little off, but her sister was way off.
Yeah, so she was 10 instead of 12, but
So it's, you have little things like that that may not give you the whole answer, but it can at least give you some clues to something that you're trying to find out.
And that's what I think is important. It at least steers you in the right direction. One of the valuable things to me that I have is this, and obviously you're not going to be able to read anything of it. Even if you could read it, it's in the old German script, and I have it this way as a way of preserving it, which I found after I put it in there was not the best way, but at the time I had it. It's dated 1828, and my parents had it and valued it to a certain extent. So they didn't display it or anything, but it's about my great-great-grandfather, and it's a document that assures him of continued employment for his life. And so, well, they really liked him. They're giving him this contract. It's very nice. Well, much later, when I started genealogy, I got his diaries, and as I was reading through his diaries, then I found out what this was for. Well, in Germany, you needed to become a citizen before you could legally get married. Well, in order to become a citizen, you had to have some proof that you were going to continue to be employed. My great-great-grandfather was employed by the congregation as what they called the lead singer, a cantor, educator, everything, a leader of the community there, and that was his job. And so almost everybody in the community signed it. And I also found out from his diaries, which was interesting, which is sort of off the topic, but this is what I learned from it, that one person refused to sign it. And he went home and cried. He wrote this in his diaries. He went home and cried because now he couldn't become a citizen. If he couldn't become a citizen, he couldn't get married. And the mayor said, "No, you've been such an asset to the community. It'll go through. Don't worry about it." And in fact, one time he was talking to the mayor. This other guy came by that didn't sign it. And the mayor said to him, "Why didn't you sign it?" And the guy turns around and walks away and never did answer the mayor. But anyway, he became a citizen and then was able to get married. So one little thing that we have here was totally misinterpret it as to the use of it or as to what it was for until I found out other material.
Well, and when we find things, we have to put them in the context of the time frame when they were created and know what was really going on to totally understand them. I mean, I've certainly misinterpreted things, particularly if we apply today's standards to the time period when we may find an artifact or a document or record, and vice versa. And one thing to mention while we have that, and you're talking about keeping it and all, what I recommend to people, I had a lady the other night when I did a program for a society, brought me some documents from the Civil War era. And they were all folded up as they had been probably from the beginning. And she's unfolding them and refolding them. And the first thing I said to her was, you want to unfold them and flatten them, get them in a Mylar sleeve, something that's acid-free, and leave them flat. And the other thing is, if you're going to work with that, take a scan of it. Scan it on a scanner. The amount of light is not going to hurt it to do that. And then work with that scanned image when you're doing your research and all. Bring it out only sparingly.
I think that's a marvelous idea. And if a document or whatever you have is too big for a scanner, digital camera works just as well. Just stand directly over it and
well, and some places, we have FedEx, which is an office supply place. FedEx will now do larger images. It used to be, and I don't know whether they still do go to the national conferences, but Ancestry used to bring a camera, because I have my great-grandparents' marriage record from the church that they were married in, and it's probably about 24 by 16 or 18, and the whole edge is starting to crumple. And so the first thing I did with it again was get it rolled out and flattened out, and then in the Mylar sleeve. And I took it to one of the conferences, and they set it up and took a camera, but it was a great big camera that was in the building that they raised up the camera to get the whole image. And so with that, I print out a paper copy whenever I want to use it.
And then you can scale it down a bit to something that you can easily carry around. But yeah, so anyway, I guess the point is that, especially with the document, you don't really know anything about it. Do you want to look at
Sometimes you don't. We've got a will that Sydney had an interest in, and it's a will made by my great-grandfather. Actually, I have both my great-grandmother and grandfathers. They came over in 1885 and 1887 from Glasgow, Scotland to Philadelphia, and they both made wills. His is relatively short, as hers was, and the one thing about it is this was not a will that would have gone to probate, because they later moved to New Jersey, and so they would have had to have created a whole new will. But it told me a little bit about them, what they owned, the fact that where they were living, the date of the will, the fact that they owned property. And one of the things I did learn from his will, because they were slightly different, his will mentioned the property that they owned in Summers Point that they eventually built a house on and moved down after retirement to that house. But I also learned from his will that he certainly didn't have perfect spelling. Some of the words in there are definitely phonetically spelled.
You said he was from Scotland. I wonder if they might spell it differently.
No, because they did use English. It's just, the words were spelled. You can obviously see they're spelling it phonetically rather than
would
properly.
Something like that have been, if had to be, would that have held up in court?
Well,
I mean, there's no witness or anything?
If they, at the time period, yes, what they would have done was they would have brought either other examples of his handwriting and probably had someone from the court that could say yes, just like we have expert witnesses today that will
Yeah.
verify handwriting, probably they would have had someone, or family members may have come in and said, yes, this is in fact his handwriting. So, that part of it, it would have held up in court.
Now,
But the fact that he moved to a different state meant that he couldn't use that
Oh,
will.
really? Oh, but he gave everything to his wife. Wouldn't things have gone to his wife anyway, or would they have gone to his children?
Well, I'd have to go back and check Pennsylvania law at that
okay.
time. I would suspect that it normally would have gone to his wife. And in this case, if he had died in Pennsylvania and she had died before him, or since hers was basically the same thing other than some of the items mentioned in it in the two were different, then whoever survived, the estate would have gone like an intestate estate had they not had a will, which probably would have been to the children and possibly some other heirs. It depends on what the actual law is in the state at the time when somebody dies. But it was certainly helpful to me because then I had an idea of when they may have owned the property or purchased the property down in Summers Point. This was before I really went looking for a deed to verify that.
Well, I've seen another will too, and it's, fancy will, with all of the whatever you need.
Yes.
And yet the person for whom the will was, and he was owner of property, signed it with an X.
Oh, yes.
So that he couldn't, it was interesting to me that he couldn't seem to read and write in English, at least in English. I don't know, maybe maybe before he was.
Well, and what time period was that? Do you remember?
When did he die? In the 20th century, early 20th century, I think about 1920. But he came to this country in the 1840s, 1880s, I mean. But he obviously owned property,
and I wouldn't think that that's all that unusual that he might not have been able to write. I have seen cases where I would have thought that the husband would have been able to write, and he obviously didn't, but his wife did. Where I've seen where he is signed with an X and she has signed her name, but normally what happens there. Because earlier in the 1800s, I have a third great-grandfather, who signed his will with an X. Now, he was a man owned lots of property and run a sawmill and a farm and everything else. He could not write, and his wife could. And so he signed with the X, but then there were witnesses there to witness his signature, and so going into court, they went in and verified that he was in fact signing the will.
Yeah, I think in those days you were able to get along without the education that you need today, and you needed your wits and your common sense, and most of any kind of work except teaching was manual labor of some kind, so that you didn't need a whole lot of reading and writing to be able to get along.
And the other thing too, my great-grandfather, I know that his father died about the time he was 8 years old. So I'm sure that probably ended any formal education he may be getting, because I'm sure that the other children had to go out and get a job to help support the family. He did have one brother who was about 2 years older, but he was the second oldest. So, usually that happened.
Well, I think before public education, not only, even if the kids didn't go to work, they had to have been the money to pay for the education. And I don't really know exactly when public schools started, but it's sort of a revolutionary idea that the schools are free. So, it's not only that they didn't have, that it wasn't there, that they had to work, but you had to pay for it, and pay for your books and everything else. You want to talk about your
Yes,
little picture there?
This is one that has a pretty good story to it.
Let's hold that up against your shirt a little bit. So yeah, if I hold it, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's a lovely little picture.
It's from a tea service set of my great-grandparents that came from Scotland, and it was given to them on their 25th anniversary, which happened to be 1912. And my great-grandparents, after they moved down to Somers Point, their oldest daughter, third child in order of children, and oldest daughter was the typical daughter, never married, lived with mom and dad, and when her parents died, she continued to stay in the house, and she died, unfortunately, of cerebral hemorrhage in 1942. She was working in a canvas factory for the war effort, and she happened to have a car and would drive a carpool to work, and the employee showed up to go to work one day, and she didn't answer the door, and somehow they got in and found her dead on the floor. And the family had lived in Philadelphia, had cemetery lots in Philadelphia, so the day of the funeral, which took place at 2 o'clock, they had the funeral down in Somers Point, which is near Ocean City, New Jersey. And then they took her to Philadelphia and buried her, went back to my grandfather's oldest brother's house. At that time, there was still living my grandfather, his older brother, and their younger sister. And they went back to the older brother's house and decided that the next day they would go down and start cleaning out the house. Well, my grandfather and his sister arrived and found their brother had gone in and cleaned out all that he wanted out of the house. So my grandfather had a pair of binoculars that during World War II, there was a shortage of binoculars and telescopes and spy glasses, and so the government asked that these people loan the government these, and if they could, they would return them after the war. So my grandfather loaned his pair of binoculars, and he did get them back. I have letters from the government that he got them back. Well, one of the things his brother took was the binoculars, but one of the things he overlooked was the cream pitcher. And so my grandfather let it be known that when he got his binoculars back, he could have the cream pitcher. Well, I don't remember when it was. I think it was probably the early 1970s. My grandfather gave my mother the cream pitcher, and when we were cleaning out my parents' house, lo and behold, I pulled out this black as coal pitcher because she hadn't shined it or polished it in years. And I knew right away what it was, and
because you heard the story.
I said over and over again, I heard the story, and I said to my sisters, who wants it? And nobody wanted it.
Oh.
So I have the cream pitcher, and actually I have a china cabinet that was my great-grandparents'. I suspect I had that refinished, and I suspect that's probably where the tea service was kept, but it now resides at my house in...
You have the whole tea service?
No, I have just the pitcher. So I don't know what happened to the tea service, but my grandfather and his brother never really spoke after that. They communicated through the sister, and when I got into genealogy, and it's just been a few years ago that I finally had communication with my grandfather's oldest brother's son, and I've gone up and met him, and I've met his children, and one of his nephews had tried to get in touch with my grandfather in about 1968 or 69. He was doing genealogy research to talk to my grandfather, and my grandfather refused to speak to him because of whose grandson he was. So I've been tempted to ask my mother's cousin, does he know what happened to the rest of the tea service? But it has little side stories that happen to it. But, you know, again, it's something that it really didn't add information to me because I knew when they were married and I knew the story. But
it fills in about your family.
It fills in some things, and certainly you can share things like this by taking pictures, or like with documents, you could take the documents and scan them and share them with other family members, and certainly write up the story about the item.
That's all in my book.
And
so.
have it shared with anybody that has an interest in it.
Another thing that was in his diaries was that, and it was like a little, about a typing piece of paper size, a little bit larger. It was a German size. Lovely poem for his 50 years of service. And when I was able to locate a descendant from Bernard Kahn's oldest daughter, I'm descended from the younger daughter, came over, showed all of this stuff to her, and a few days later I got a telephone call. You know that lovely poem which mentions the silver chalice? My brother has it.
Ah.
And if you look back, it was that family that emigrated first to the United States in around 1900. And what do you give somebody as a memento? Certainly not all of these diaries that he wrote, paper and all of this stuff, which my parents brought over, but you give him a silver chalice. It was a beautiful silver cup. I call it a chalice because it's so big, this big, and a cover on it. Big fancy covers. The whole thing stood about that tall. And it just says his name and 50 years. So he knew it was something. He really knew nothing at all about it. He just knew it was some ancestor of his. So it was interesting to next time he came to, he lived on the West Coast. Next time he came to the East Coast to put the two things together, they saw the document, and I have this lovely picture of that silver cup.
I have the same thing. I have my grandfather's pocket watch. He was an employee on a dairy farm, and we know that he was working there in March of 1914 when my father's oldest brother was born, but we don't know exactly how early prior to his birth that he was working there. But it was given to him in 1951 for over 30 years of service, and I actually have a picture of the dinner where it was given and all, and I ended up with it mainly because my father had 3 brothers and there were 3 watches, and only one brother had an interest in the watch. So then my aunt, who had my grandfather had lived with, said to me one time, "I've got 2 pocket watches here. Would you want one?" And I said, "Well, what about?" I said, "What about your sons?" Because she had 3 boys, and she said, "I have 2 watches and 3 sons. Who doesn't get one?" So I said, "Okay, I will take the one," and I wanted the pocket watch. I had wristwatches, but I wanted the pocket watch.
It always seems strange to me that you've got this employee who's been coming for umpteen years to work. When they retire, when time means less and you don't have to clock in on something, then they give him a watch.
Well, he actually didn't retire. He didn't retire for another 7 years. The farm was sold, and he retired about 1958 and moved off the farm. But he still continued to work part-time, but I've remembered that particular pocket watch. He wore it daily, and I did have to have a little bit of work done on it. So,
does it still run, or do you know something?
Yes, it does. In fact, I got it out last week, and I wound it, and yes, it still runs.
Now, this little wine cup was given to Sid's mother for some service that she had done to the congregation that we belonged to. So it's just, it's little, but it's special to me. I know, what she did, and it just says from the parents' board, given to her from the parents' board. So it's a cute little thing, but I cherish it because you know who it belonged to.
Yes.
And you just, in this case, it's only a generation away. We know what it was from. I mean.
But something to be passed down generations.
Yeah, but you know, when you start passing things down from generation to generation, you're going to end up with a whole lot of stuff, and you've got to make a decision. You can't really keep more than 1 or 2 things from somebody. Or
Well, and that's true. The other thing is, you know, as the generations, it's like, okay, with my grandfather's pocket watch,
gets it?
I have 6 nephews. Who's going to get it down the road? Fortunately, I have other things that I probably will have enough for everybody to get something from someone.
Okay, our slide is up there now.
Yes, this.
I
is
love that when I
how
saw
I
it.
ended
Thank
up my presentation.
But you know, you say you have enough nephews, but not enough, everybody's going to be interested in it.
Well, that's true.
And
that's true.
One thing I suggest, because I learned that from Sid's mother, this person here, that she says, you want something? Go stick your name on the back of it. And I mean, there was stuff when they were when Sid's brother was cleaning out, oh, you know, there's a name on there, and then they knew right away. There wasn't any question who it went to. And some people are interested in something old, and some couldn't care less.
Yeah.
And I have a tablecloth that belonged to my grandmother. My grandmother died when my mother was an infant, so my mother never even knew. My mother was less than 2 when she died. It's got my initials on it. You know, that's why it came to me when I got married. Mm-hmm. It's like an Irish linen, and you look at it cross-eyed and it wrinkles. So. You know, I said, anybody want this? I used to use it for special occasions, but it's long, and I don't have a table that even fits it now. So it hangs in my closet. I asked my daughter-in-laws, does anybody want this? Oh no, we might have to iron it. Nobody's interested in it, but it's a shame. I know, you know, it's hand embroidered in the initials and stuff. There was part of her trousseau, so it's got to be well over 100 years old. But nobody wants something like that anymore.
Something like that, you might find a museum that might have an interest in it.
White on white tablecloth.
You never know what a museum may want.
And it's lovely, but it wrinkles like crazy. So yeah, what are you going to do with it? Okay, well, I hope that gives people some idea of how they can use their heirlooms and artifacts and so on to do a little bit more fleshing out of the family.
And tell the stories about them.
Yeah.